Hey, it's Mike here, and today a very recent Swedish study that has everybody thinking that they need to eat more full-fat dairy in order to lower their cardiovascular disease risk. There was then a subsequent media frenzy, and people just love to hear butter is back over and over again. It's like greatest hits of good news about your bad habits. But there's something very interesting going on here that I have never talked about before, the way that they actually made dairy look good in this case. And that brings us to these particular biomarkers that they used in the study, biomarkers for dairy intake. We're gonna look at various studies on those, and let's just say that there are some major flaws with using this biomarker. We're also gonna investigate for conflicts of interest and funding and all that stuff. Let's go. A lot of news articles came out about this. A lot of you sent me them, and thank you for that. I mean, we had ones from CNN. We even had some from America's dairy-loving cheese capital, Wisconsin. Quote, study finds consuming more dairy fat can lower risk of cardiovascular disease. Yes, encouraging people to eat more. But the winner might be this one out of The Guardian. Somehow this prompted them to also tack on steak and salt as foods that are actually good to eat. We're not here to talk about steak in detail, but yeah, they try and debunk the WHO while citing zero studies. You get the point. Let's move on. You know, since Time's cover with butter on it, every couple years there seems to be some major campaign to get people feeling good about eating saturated fat again. This can get pretty frustrating, and that's why I need to keep level-headed by inventing my alter ego, Debunk Monk. I am not mad. I am utterly calm. I will not let my patience curdle. Moo is actually just ohm backwards. This, let's just get to the study. All right, here's the study. It's a bit different than a lot of studies in that this is sort of 2-in-1 in that they had a 4,000 person cohort that they were following, and then they also added that to a general meta-analysis of more studies for results. So yeah, this is a meta-analysis, but to be clear, this is a meta-analysis of observational studies, which will matter later when we're talking about one about trials. As for those biomarkers, they were looking at 3 particular fat biomarkers in the blood, and from the Swedish cohort, they found that one of those 3 was associated with a lower incidence of cardiovascular disease, and to the meta-analysis itself, which is of course more data, they found that 2 out of 3 of the biomarkers were at 12 and 14% lower risk of cardiovascular disease for the high versus low thirds of blood levels. So higher levels meant lower risk by a bit, a notable amount. So we just have to investigate these biomarkers. Let's back up. What are these anyway? Let's focus on the 2 biomarkers that had the positive results. We're talking about these fatty acids that end up in the blood. One of them is 15-0 or pentadecanoic acid. The other is 17-0 or heptadecanoic acid. They're fancy words for just 15 and 17. We'll just call them that from now on. And these are also often referred to as odd chain fatty acids. And from this study, yes, they are created in the ruminant digestive system of cows. And the main claim around them is that they are better biomarkers of dairy consumption than even doing surveys on intake, because people can be inaccurate with that, but these blood levels have to be accurate. Well, do they? But I want to argue that no, these are not great measures of dairy intake and dairy intake only. Looking to that number 17 acid, which was most associated with the healthier measures in the meta-analysis. Well, from this paper, concentrations of 17-0 in the blood of vegans were as high as in dairy fat consumers. And the study didn't check that 15-0 fatty acid, so it could have been just as high, we don't know. But shouldn't everybody's mind be blown? Because vegans do not eat dairy unless vegans are actually ruminants. I have been told that we consume grass directly from lawns. That's our first hint that this biomarker thing has some major issues, and that brings us on to the topic that we all love here, fiber. And it really is amazing what kind of research just exists nowadays. Perhaps you're trying to ask the question, has any study put dairy directly up against fiber and seen which is more correlated with these odd chain fatty acids? This study did just that, but also in the context of heart disease patients, which is crazy. From this study at least, they found that fatty acid 17-0 is more highly correlated with fiber intake than it is with dairy intake. They used a coefficient R to measure the correlation, which is from 0 to 1, where 0 is not at all and 1 is a perfect correlation. And that dairy correlation was only a 0.11. The fiber correlation was 0.19, which is 70% higher. Neither of those are amazing for correlation, but still worth mentioning. And this is backed by other epidemiology from this paper again, quote, "In the EPIC study, the odd-chain fatty acid concentrations in plasma phospholipids were also significantly associated with the intake of fruits and vegetables naturally rich in fibers." But it's more than just an association. It seems to be pretty mapped out that there's a mechanism here, a legit one, and that brings us to two plant compounds or fiber-related derivatives, Inulin and Propionate, which you've probably heard on my channel before. Inulin is in various plant foods. It's in wheat and a bunch of vegetables. We're going to get more into it in a second. We're going to get more into propionate as well, but just know that it is a gut metabolite that is created from eating fiber. And from rat studies, we've known for longer that these two compounds would lead to an increased level of these odd-chain fatty acids. But now we actually have this randomized crossover trial on humans, very high quality design, flip stuff around. And their findings were that both inulin and propionate increased both of those fatty acids, number 15 and 17, between 11 and 17%, depending on which one. And they actually touch on the mechanism even in their conclusion, quote, "Our data show that gut-derived propionate is used for the hepatic liver synthesis of odd-chain fatty acids in humans." So as the title alludes to, odd-chain fatty acids are biomarkers for fiber intake. I also want to mention that both inulin and propionate lower cholesterol absorption, which is extremely pertinent here, as well as telling you when you're full, which is also huge because overeating does not help with heart disease. And we do have to put all of this in context and ask the question, how powerful is fiber when it comes to heart disease? Well, let's go to this meta-analysis of 31 studies, no joke. And yeah, fiber is definitely lowering all types of cardiovascular disease risk, from death to heart disease and stroke in particular, so pretty solid. And I have an inkling that the researchers are aware of this to some degree. Thankfully, Healthline, which tends to have a more low-carb slant, actually included this quote from one of the researchers, that yeah, the biomarkers are partly influenced by factors other than dairy fat, but they say our study does not suggest any harm of dairy fat per se. Yeah, that's kind of becoming a big assumption now with what we know. And all of this becomes more backed up when you look at that third biomarker, which is actually just a little bit of a trans fat that is in dairy. And no, it doesn't appear that you're going to get it from many other sources, especially not fiber. So yeah, this actually appears to be a good marker of high-fat dairy consumption. And it didn't have a benefit here, so we're talking about biomarker number 1, a marker for fiber, which was beneficial. Marker 2, marker also for fiber, which is beneficial. Marker 3, fiber's not connected, not beneficial. Maybe a little pattern here. Y'all are just trying to take all the credit for fiber's hard work, but we got to zoom out and think about what public effects this might have in terms of health. And thankfully, there are people in Sweden that are taking a different viewpoint than this main study. This study in the same journal actually says that the shifting attitudes towards saturated fat that are more favorable, of like eating butter and stuff, could actually lead to more heart disease deaths. In other words, this type of information is probably going to kill not only Swedish people, but a lot more people. So before we get into conflicts of interest and funding and all that stuff, I just want to do a little bit of a lightning round on saturated fat and look at some of the other research to compare this to. And I just have to mention right off the bat, yeah, European authorities like this one are saying that yes, saturated fat raises LDL, which is causally linked to atherosclerosis. And yes, more research continues to come out that is backing this notion. I mean, we have this 2020 meta-analysis, and this is of higher quality evidence than the observational studies from the main one on biomarkers, because this is looking at randomized control trials together in a meta-analysis, which yes, can determine causation. Observational studies cannot, and if you're wondering about funding, this was funded by the World Health Organization anyway. The result was that reducing saturated fat for not even that many years, because the studies weren't that long, lowers cardiovascular disease risk by 21%. Also supporting causality, they found that there was a dose-dependent response, so the more people lowered saturated fat, the better their cardiovascular disease risk was. But a lot of those studies didn't even lower saturated fat by very much, which they allude to, which just brings me to what happens if people really, really lower it. And that brings me to Ornish's randomized control trial, which, yeah, lowered the cardiovascular events by 60%. So Very, very legit. Finally, I think these Swedish researchers should learn from their neighbors over there in Finland and their North Karelia project, which had ridiculous results. They were finding that Finnish men had basically the highest cholesterol levels in the entire world. They wanted to turn it around, so they lowered the amount of saturated fat that people ate, hoping that it would lower cholesterol. They did some other things as well, but yeah, lowering saturated fat by almost half. The result, as you can see from this chart, is that their cholesterol went from about 260 milligrams per deciliter to 209. Still bad, but way better. And people using butter in cooking went down from 70 to 20%, and people using vegetable oil instead went from just 10% of people to 50% of people. So yeah, Nina Teicholz is definitely crapping her pants hearing this, especially because the end result was an 84% lower heart disease mortality in these middle-aged men. So a ridiculous benefit. And all this swapping of different fats kind of brings me to a very important point in the realm of dairy industry studies and studies around dairy in general. And that is that it's usually pretty much always in the context of a Western diet where people are usually just swapping out one animal fat for another. It's not just lowering saturated fat. So you can make dairy look neutral or even good when people are swapping out processed meats and that saturated fat for dairy saturated fat. But you're gonna be way, way better off swapping both of those for plant-based saturated fats. And that brings me to this study. From the 11 studies, they looked at a 5% lower saturated fat intake, which was replaced by polyunsaturated fats, was associated with a 26% lower coronary death rate. I think I made my point clear, so let's just move on to conflicts of interest funding like that. Right off the bat, I will just say this seems to be pretty legit in that area by comparison. I mean, it's being funded by the Swedish government, or other organizations that aren't big corporations. And so from that sense, this thing looks pretty clear. Some things do stick out a little bit. Some of these authors have co-authored papers with people who are paid by the dairy industry, several of them. So we have all these dairy adjacent people, if there's any sort of connection between the dairy industry and the Swedish government would be a topic for another time. Every Swedish person that I know at least seems to be really all about dairy as a part of their culture, worth mentioning. But let's just get to the biggest problem that I see here in terms of any conflicts, if that is the issue, and that is the studies that the meta-analysis actually cited. Quite a few of them were dairy industry studies. Hopefully you guys remember how to read forest plots. If not, you can watch my video on Chris Kresser and James Wilkes and Joe Rogan. But 3 out of the 4 of those most positive studies for 17.0 were industry-funded studies by the same group of authors. First one was Swedish Dairy Association funded. Second one was literally done by an employee of the Swedish Dairy Association. Number 3 was supported by grants from the National Dairy Council. And looking at those same 3 studies in terms of that 15.0 fatty acid, yeah, because that thing is hanging on by a thread for being statistically significant because of its confidence interval going to 0.99. If that hit 1.0, it would not be statistically significant. So those 3 studies are definitely affecting the conclusion of the overall study. In the end though, I think the dairy industry wouldn't even need to cook the books because these are biomarkers for fiber. Again, that randomized crossover trial found that propionate and inulin are being turned into these odd chain fatty acids. So it appears that the dairy industry and these Swedish people have just found a back door to make dairy look good by just piggybacking off the cardiovascular benefits of fiber, which are so well documented. But again, saturated fat, the main source of which is dairy in Western societies like the US, raises LDL, bad cholesterol, which is causally linked to atherosclerosis. Now we have that meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials I showed you, the other studies as well. I mean, it's pretty clear cut. So no, I am absolutely not sold on this biomarker thing, and I hope that more people can see through this study as well, although it's unlikely because they got those dairy goggles on. Let me know what you think about all of this, if there's anything else I missed about the study, because it was quite a large one, and that's all. So like and subscribe, notification bell helps a lot, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching. Moo. Fatty acid.